Hi everyone, welcome to Goth Nick and Goth Chick, the podcast where we discuss all things Gothic in media. I'm your host, Nick Vanderwaard.
I'm co-host, Lindsay Wheeler.
Today we'll be discussing the abject, what the abject is, how it functions, and why it's important critically in Gothic texts. We'll be discussing the individuals who use the abject, the recipients of the abject, the persecuted, essentially. We'll be discussing primary texts that invoke the abject, like The Fly, Alien, Metroid, and King Diamond's Abigail. And lastly, we'll be focusing on the hypocrisy of the hero, who, using abject as a process, tends to be destroyed.
So, Nick, what is the abject?
The abject is a procedure that was outlined by Julia Kristeva. She, in the early 1980s, wrote a piece called The Powers of Horror, which outlined it as a process. Essentially, the process of abjection is to maintain a sense of normality, we have to take all that is abnormal and throw it off. There is a tendency, though, for certain people within society to be recipients. How does this apply to Gothic stories? The throwing off of things tends to establish certain norms within society, where the generation of a norm automatically creates an alien by virtue of this is normal, this is not normal. The thing that is not normal is the recipient of the things being thrown off of the normal to maintain its sense of self. And these can include a sense of the xenophobia, just things that are fearful relative to the unknown, things that are not us. They can also include a sense of the monstrous, the profane, the uncleanly, the unhealthy. So different things like that you generally don't want to be affiliated with. They go to sort of a dumping ground, which in society tends to be personified. You can't persecute a building or a location the same way that you can control or treat other people. The main point of abjection is a form of control.
Scapegoating.
It's also a form of segregating in ways that it allows one group to mistreat another group by presenting them as alien, as animal, as other. The Gothic tale will explore the application of abjection, but also its failure relative to the abjectors, those who are throwing things off of themselves, but also the recipients of that. The young, the old, you also have women, you have the disabled, and you have animals. The animals themselves can be the recipients of abuse. They can also be the recipients of signification relative to abject qualities like death and decay. If you have a Gothic story like Frankenstein, where the character has a dream of their mother and she begins rotting before the character's eyes, maggots and flies and other things begin sort of crawling out of her now suddenly rotting corpse, those insects are a signifier of death and decay. So insects, but also maggots, spiders, slugs, frogs.
Pretty much the farther you get from the human appearance, the easier it is to
find yourself in abject territory?
Yes.
Okay, yeah, definitely, totally. But it's not just like people are going around and attacking those animals, but they're applying those qualities or treating them as symbols of people within society who are being viewed unfavorably from an abject standpoint. So there's an important relationship there in terms of stories where, why are there maggots in this story? Because the story really isn't about the persecution of maggots. It's about the persecution of people who are being viewed as being associated with maggots and other undesirable things, which are associated with certain fearful aspects. Abjection occurs according to those who are afraid of something returning, hidden things, things that are pushed away from ourselves, the taboo, the profane, the uncleanly. It's also a fear of a place, a space-time, if you will. This can be something akin to a graveyard, where within a specific state of existence or within a specific location, you're more likely to encounter the dead, things that are rotting, relative to yourself. When you see a grave, an open grave with a dead body inside it, it's what to expect in the years to come. And that, in and of itself, is traumatic. People will throw that off of themselves. So a graveyard is one instance of that. Another is the womb. A space of abjection is birth, the birth site. So something that is either the vagina itself or symbolic of the vagina. In this type of space, you're either going to encounter things that are from the vagina, so blood, mucus, afterbirth, stillborn babies, actual babies. All of these things tend to come from the same source. But that source is also indicative not just of a space, but of space-time. The type of time where consciousness is infantile. In this type of space, babies come from that space, but the type of consciousness that a baby might experience is effectively mute. It's nothing. And that exposed to this, it sort of harkens back to this moment when you had no memories, or your memories are very infantile, which cause you to bawl, to cry, to shit yourself uncontrollably. It removes a sense of autonomy relative to this womb state. But it's not just connected with life, but also death, because it's a return to the womb, which, from whence all things began, all things must end. So to look upon this site where you came out of the earth, or you came out of a particular vagina, normally in Gothic stories, there's sort of a full circle approach to things, where it's not just the promise of life, but also the promise of death. And a lot of the things that come out of the womb aren't cleanly. That they are profane, they are disgusting, they're controlled too, they're policed.
Childbirth is also incredibly risky, both for the mother and child, in terms of, death is very close. There's a lot that can go wrong. It wasn't that long ago in human history that fatality rates for mothers giving birth or their children was very high.
Including that, you're also dealing with just the messiness of childbirth, but also the policing of, because you'll notice that you have the slime and the disgusting things, which would be seen as profane and disgusting, but they also have to do with childbirth as a deadly act, as a moment that is sort of not safe to do, but is also forced upon someone who is seen as other. And women, historically, would have been other. They are objects of sexual reproduction. So, to be reminded of that through these images that evoke not just one particular aspect, historically in a fearful way, but all of them kind of at once. A Gothic story doesn't attempt to divide any of these things. It instead treats fear through the symbols in a way that evokes multiple things at once. A legionary kind of midden, if you will. So if you are evoking the sense of the parthenogenic womb or the archaic mother, you're being reminded of a past that is all at once slimy and disgusting, dangerous, and brutal from a police standpoint, where women would have been forced into the role of the unwilling reproducer. So there's all of this going on at once. And it's symbolic, which means that you can kind of go in different directions with it and respond in different ways, but it tends to be unpleasant, shocking, repulsive.
And yet it's a difficult thing to fully object because everyone comes from this same origin, so you can't really throw it off of yourself.
Exactly. These characters in these stories, they're forced into the realization that it is inescapable. Everyone had a mother, right? But the symbol of the mother in these stories is all at once self-defeating, because it's a taste of, well, you came from it, and you'll go back to it eventually. You're alluding to a space-time where you may not remember what it was like to be a child, for instance. But you can feel the sense of creeping death via these symbols. But when you see the symbols, you're going to think of multiple things at once. And that's sort of the nature of fear. And where it gets interesting is the fear of persecution, the fear of disgusting things, the fear of the localization of where can I find these things. They're all occurring at once, but so is the fear of self-destruction, of upending of autonomy. When faced with these things, you see that what you think is a particular thing is actually something else. So the mother, for instance, the archaic mother is old, as sort of all-encompassing, but then there's the phallic mother, the mother as sort of monstrous, as the ultimate sort of dictator in terms of who lives and who dies, and the actual power that a woman has as a monster, as something that sort of goes beyond how we've tried to sort of control or regulate them from a patriarchal standpoint. It could be tremendously upsetting to encounter the source of all life and all death in sort of like a womb in Alien. The entire structure is basically a giant womb, and Mother, the supercomputer, looks over everyone and basically determines who lives and who dies. It controls the fate of everyone, and they're trapped inside this giant sort of structure which is motherly, and this sense of self-destruction relative to abjection as having failed. Because the whole point of abjection is to throw off all of this stuff so that you hypocritically don't have to confront your own sort of shortcomings in terms of being profane, in terms of being disgusting, in terms of being mortal. Delusions of immortality, delusions of grandeur, of autonomy are maintained through a sense of distance and self-isolation in this kind of echo chamber, except it's not that we're ever able to push these things out of our sphere, but we just ignore the fact that they exist. Because women, old people, young people, children, foreigners, they're never pushed totally outside of our social sphere. And more often than not, they are at home. People have families, people have wives and children, and all of us exhibit certain bodily functions that are, by their very nature, abject. But we're not supposed to talk about them. But we're going to encounter them. It's inevitable with things like childbirth historically. And in order for the bloodline to continue, you would have to engage in some of these unpleasant activities in a way that furthers the cycle of abuse, but also the potential for one to encounter the abject. A sire, Lord Manfred from the Castle of Otranto, for instance, wanted to continue his perfidious bloodline. He would need to reproduce, or his children would need to reproduce, except at the beginning of that story, his son is crushed by a giant falling helmet, and in his case, he has to take matters into his own hand. So he's chasing the heroine around the castle, trying to force her to marry him, and by extension, bear his children to continue his bloodline. You notice that sense of delusions of immortality, right? If I can impregnate this woman and make her bear my children, I will live on. It becomes its own kind of monster. But from the point of view of the tyrant, no matter how false they are, they're still objecting. They're still entertaining that delusion of total power. But they have to come to terms with the fact that they are not all-powerful by engaging with, say, a woman who doesn't want to bear his children, and existing within a space that is motherly. It's where he was born. It's where he inherited all of his power, but also the ingrained behaviors of abjection, which later he confronts, which cause him to experience a feeling of, like, self-destruction. All of these behaviors are taught, and they're taught from the environment around us, and language is kind of extending out from ourselves. Humans are funny like that. These aren't instincts. They're things that are taught through symbols and language, where you have an insect, you have an old woman, you have a child, you have a pregnant woman. These are actual things that exist in reality, but there's also a symbolic component where you can take something, the symbol of these things, and use that to communicate certain messages, even if those messages would seem like they're in your best interest. They're a form of self-protection.
Mm-hmm.
Distance yourself from the profane, the disgusting, the informative in a way that would sort of self-defeat. Because the tyrant is happier if he's ignorant. Mm-hmm. It's a sense of ignorance is bliss, right? Mm-hmm. That type of total ignorance, it's a foregone conclusion that that's going to fail, because the tyrant's power to be able to keep things totally separate is fallible. And the space around him, he's inevitably going to encounter things that are kind of paradoxical. Like, oh, if I'm all powerful, why do I have a mother? Why does this place remind me of being a child? Or remind me of being younger than a child, being a baby? Mm-hmm. Why does it contain things that gross me out or disgust me? Mm-hmm. The Gothic loves to explore that sense of self-destruction relative to these other components, the fear of the place, the return of the place as a graveyard, as a womb, mm-hmm. the fear of the profane, and some of the other disgusting elements, the controlled or policed elements, yeah. And then the fear of persecution, because if someone, it's not just their sense of self that's destroyed, but they realize that they can become the subject of the very abuses that they've inflicted upon others.
Oh yeah, it's a fine line.
But an important component of the Gothic relative to the abject, in terms of all of these things, is the point of view of the other, which is experienced through a witness, an uncooperative witness, usually someone who thinks they're better than they actually are. Mm. There's a sense of hypernormal about them, where they're really trying their damnedest to think, oh, well, I'm not like this. But they're constantly being exposed to all of these things that remind them who they actually are, where they actually came from, and that they're not so different from these people that they're persecuting. And the people that are being persecuted, the things that are being persecuted, have no voice. Mm-hmm. It's been silenced by a human power. And that the only way that they can be heard is through abject sensation, by someone throwing all of these things off. And if that abject recipient, the midden, if they can make themselves seen, all they have to do is reflect that back on the individual. They don't even have to say anything. It's just look. And then all of the things that have been thrown off of those normal individuals, they will be forced to see by looking at the recipients of this abject process.
A good example would be pretty much any depiction of the undead, whether it's ghosts, zombies, just seeing a relative you know is dead, mm-hmm. but just that reminder of death, which of itself is very abject.
In terms of the voiceless component?
Well, coming back to sort of haunt the living, in a sense.
In terms of the abject, there is a reminder of death. Mm-hmm. Let's say you look at like a family portrait. Yeah. And there's a sense of being haunted by someone that you know is mm-hmm. dead. The abject will generally focus on those mortal components of death, the visceral. So if you see someone who's dead, you're actually going to be dealing with a corpse. Mm-hmm. You're actually going to be dealing with a sense of mental decline in the elderly, for instance, dementia, Parkinson's, other diseases that result in the death of memory, the return to an infantile state. For all intents and purposes, when you're dealing with someone whose mental faculties are that of a child, or less than that of a child, like that of a baby, where they can't clothe themselves, they can't feed themselves, they're drooling, they are incontinent, they require constant care, that sense of returning to a womb-like state. And what is very near the womb-like state? Death. And that sense of being haunted by someone who is dead, the return of a deathly sort of presence. Mm-hmm. The living get to experience that abject horror and all the implications of that relative to the sense of oneself, like I'm going to die, or I'm looking upon someone that maybe that could happen to me. Just looking at them, it's like a gut punch or a gut reaction or response. It generally is a sneaking feeling that over the course of the story, you come to realize the horror of what you were feeling earlier on. The Shadow over Innsmouth is a good example of that, where the character goes to this town that is alien to him. When he gets there, there's a sense of okay, this is just your standard issue American fishing town. But there's something a bit off about the individuals. They seem alien. They seem fishy, literally. They have the Innsmouth look where they have large eyes and dry, scaly skin. And the character is very critical of that. Mm-hmm. And he sees himself as normal, but his sense of normal is challenged by the presence of something that he fears is going to destroy him, according to that sense of self that he's trying to protect through the entire story. He feels like he's being hunted, so he's off in the shadows, hiding from the fish people, the deep ones, as they emerge from the water. And to look upon them, he is disgusted, he's horrified. But then he learns the truth, that he's related to them, that he is a fish person, and that the only difference is how he sees himself relative to them. He sees himself as normal relative to what these creatures represent, which is everything that he's thrown off of himself, that he's abjected to maintain his own sense of personhood. Mm-hmm. And that personhood is the ultimate casualty of the story, but he remains what's left, that sense of self that has been obliterated by the presence of that dark reflection.
But, I mean, as far as the abject goes in media, it doesn't always have to be this sort of creeping feeling. It can be much more blatant, yeah?
Yes. So, yeah, absolutely. Though, it kind of depends. For instance, Alien, right? Where you have the characters wake up in kind of a womb-like existence, where the chamber that they awake from is soft, spongy, and there's this dreamy kind of music, and then they kind of emerge from their containers and they wander out naked, sort of dead to the world, and then they gradually return to a state of consciousness. And then from that point forward, things get increasingly more abject. But early on, it's just kind of intimated. Or when they talk about Mother, she's just a computer. But then things get increasingly more grandiose towards the end of the film, where, again, this phallic female kind of thing walking around the ship, that Mother versus the computer Mother, and that the ship around them has become much more abject in a motherly sense. The point being is that early in the film, these types of feelings, if you do experience them at all, are going to be very small. But towards the end of the film, there's steam, and there's slime, and there's dead bodies on the ground, and it gets more and more grotesque, more and more overt.
Well, even gross-out horror, I would think, falls into that category of abject, since it usually relies on the revealing of things that are normally
excluded.
Yeah, kept hidden.
Yes, yeah, and I'm not saying that those aren't abject. They absolutely 100% are. But it's not uncommon for stories to start with the suggestion of it in a dreamlike way that later becomes reality. Frankenstein begins with a dream. Vathek began with a dream. The Castle of Otranto began with a dream. King Diamond's Abigail began with a dream. Abigail's a really good example of the abject relative to childbirth. Jonathan Batius and Miriam LeVay. Jonathan is the heir, and they go back to his residence they've inherited, but there Miriam becomes impregnated with the spirit of Abigail, who was this infant witch, or she was this spirit that did the same thing to the Count, whose own wife slept with a witch. Upon doing that, she became pregnant with the spirit of evil, or the spirit of Abigail. He killed her, the baby came out dead, and the Count, in order to deal with that, had his 7 best men nail her down with silver spikes. Again, all that superstitious kind of stuff. How do you deal with something like that? That was their solution. It's a bit bizarre.
Yeah.
And they take it out to a burial site and sort of inter it permanently, but it's within the space. The burial ground is within the space. So 100 years later, or however long it takes Jonathan and Miriam to go back to inherit what's theirs, they also inherit Abigail, who isn't dead, because Abigail doesn't represent something that can be killed. She represents the abject, which is all of these things that are going to return to us inevitably. And it's told through this a cycle of reproduction, because what ends up happening to Miriam is the same thing that happened to the Count's wife. The ghost of the Count is cavorting with Jonathan, saying, look, you have to kill Miriam. If you don't, she's going to be possessed by the spirit of Abigail. What ends up happening is Jonathan refuses. She becomes pregnant, quickly pregnant, through that supernatural kind of pregnancy, a fear of pregnancy in a way that's poorly misunderstood, where you're almost reverting to a different space and time where people thought of pregnancy as an invasion of ghosts and demons. And you're entertaining that notion relative to the fear of pregnancy, which is a very real thing. Mm-hmm. So again, being afraid of being pregnant, being told through this kind of Gothic story, is a way for people to sort of respond to their own fears of motherhood, where that would have had historical implications. Like, if you're a mother, historically, that's all you're going to be. It's a loss of power and autonomy, not just to your body's response, but to the patriarch telling you that you're going to have his child to continue his bloodline. The Count, in that story, killed his wife because she threatened his bloodline. It was a bastard child. And that went on to sort of curse the family, which later ends in the total annihilation of the Count's bloodline when Jonathan is killed at the end of the story by Miriam, who is possessed by Abigail. Mm-hmm. Abigail emerges from Miriam. Miriam dies from fright, another Gothic concept. Mm-hmm. The baby starts eating her dead body, and then the 7 horsemen show up out from the forest, and they take Abigail out to the burial ground to destroy her once again. But you'll notice that it's kind of futile at that point. Jonathan is dead. He was the last of his bloodline. Miriam is dead, and Abigail will forever be a part of this space. Mm-hmm. So no matter how hard you try to distance yourself from it, separate it, you can't. And it's the one thing that will survive. What we are, ourselves, that Ozymandias sense of self. I am Ozymandias, king of kings. Gaze upon my works, ye mighty, and despair. Nothing beside that colossal wreck remained. The bare and level sands stretch far away. So there's this sense of disintegration. But the Gothic focuses on the icky stuff, the sense of birth, the reminders that we're going to die, we're going to rot, if you will. You had mentioned earlier how the abject tends to focus on things in a very overt, acute kind of way, where it forces you to confront things that are pushed away, that are disgusting. Bodily fluids of different kinds, not just blood, but semen, whatever else can come out of the human body that we care not to think about.
Irrespective of what we're just speaking about as far as childbirth, the chest bursters in Alien would be a good example of being very abject. It does harken back to a sort of birth that it's explosive and gory and...
Mm-hmm. It's very sudden.
Yes.
Part of that is just it's operating within movie conventions.
Mm-hmm.
It's sort of an express elevator to some of these feelings. The person gets pregnant quickly and then the thing bursts out of them in 45 minutes or something like that. You're operating under like narrative time. So it's actually longer than that relative to the story, but it's still a relatively short period. We're talking a handful of days. Mm-hmm. And it's a tremendous surprise, but then all of a sudden you're forced to confront things in a very abject way. You're forced to confront your own mortality and also fears of childbirth. Cain in Alien, where he is impregnated by this maternal threat, right? It's literally an egg that forces itself upon him and rapes him. Mm-hmm. Then from that point forward, he's forced to give birth, and he's not even aware of it. But all of the other characters are, and they're kind of stuck in that situation where the sense of the abject also has an infectious quality. Like, if it is something sort of undesirable or unclean, exposure to it can infect the ship. So notice how there are different kinds of things going on. On one hand, it's just something that you kind of push off yourself from a social standpoint. It's also being treated as a disease, a parasite, an alien organism. So it's symbolic, because when you have the instance of something that is abject, like blood or maggots or flies crawling on the walls, you're not actually, in a Gothic sense, just referring to actual flies that are crawling on the walls, but they represent something relative to the space, relative to the person who's afraid of death, who's afraid of becoming like an infant or becoming like an old man, or who is afraid of xenophobia, fear of the unknown. I have an actual example of Go ahead.
While we're on the topic of flies and maggots, I was just going to segue into the fly, but...
Oh, yeah, absolutely. That's a good example.
Especially when we're talking about childbirth, there is that scene in the movie with Jeff Goldblum, that Cronenberg film, right?
Yes.
And there's that scene where she's having a dream about giving birth to the child that she's pregnant with, but comes out some kind of maggot.
Yeah, it's literally a giant maggot.
And that harkens to other fears revolving around pregnancy, not just of the threat of death to the mother or the child, but also whether or not the child will be normal.
The appearance of things can be deceiving, and the child can seem normal and then later be monstrous. Mm-hmm. And that's told through a dream, and then later the dream sort of comes to pass. And it's an allusion to her relationship with Seth Brundle, where Seth seems normal at first, and then there's a hidden component that she's not aware of, where he goes into the telepod, there's a fly, and then it's a gene splicing type situation where it doesn't kill him, but it causes him to slowly turn into an insect from the inside out, mm-hmm. which culminates in his skin falling off towards the very end of the film, and he emerges as this 180-pound housefly man hybrid, Brundlefly. It's neither insect nor man. The movie isn't about a fear of flies. It's not about a fear of maggots, but how those fuse within more common fears, like fear of childbirth, fear of deformity, fear of relationships and rejection, and other things that can result from being intimate with someone. Because Ronnie, played by Gina Davis, loves Seth Brundle's character, but the conundrum at the end of the film is that the other man, Stathis loves Ronnie. Ronnie doesn't love Stathis, she loves Seth Brundle. But Stathis saves her life, saves her from being transformed into the ultimate family, which is a combination of her, Seth, the baby that's inside Ronnie, and the housefly. Stathis shoots the cables, which disables her telepod as a part of the experiment. Trying to escape from his telepod, Brundlefly smashes the door. Part of the telepod and him are teleported and fused into the container where everyone is meant to go. Mm-hmm. That door opens up. There's the mist and the light come out, almost like a birthing moment in the film. What new hideous offspring is created? Brundlefly fused with the door of the telepod, and we get to see it. And notice how there's a sense of birth and fusion relative to these fears that are entirely sort of like symbolic, but they're also connected to very real, tangible things. You're not just dealing with the guts and the slime, but how your mind responds to that to create new fear-bound progenies. What is this particular offspring? And then you're forced to confront the thing itself at the very end.
Well, and although you did mention that this isn't really a story about a fear of flies necessarily, the abjection of insects, especially ones associated with decay and disease, is definitely a factor, because the story wouldn't have nearly the same effect if, say, we're dealing with a fusion with a squirrel or something.
I agree, 100%. Though I did see a movie that actually, it was Zombievers.
Oh, God.
And there is a moment where the beaver emerges from the inside out in a very similar kind of way. It's actually kind of nasty. And it's a very goofy kind of film.
Yeah.
But it isn't as effective because the squirrel doesn't represent the same as a symbol. It's not connected with abject things. Mm-hmm. It's a rodent that collects nuts from trees, and it's associated with walnut trees, which are, abjectly speaking, inert, whereas flies are associated with actual death and decay. A real-life anecdotal example, when my brother and his wife, my sister-in-law, got home from a vacation and found their apartment infested with blot flies.
Those are flesh flies. Flesh flies is a common name for that you would find associated with decaying matter.
Are they larger?
Yes.
Okay.
Pretty chunky flies.
Chunky flies. And I remember them explaining, okay, first they had to deal with it. They had to clean. Mm-hmm. They had to sanitize their apartment. So when you're confronted with that, in reality, you're going to want to sanitize it. The same approach is also taken symbolically. In an attempt to self-preserve, symbolically, you're going to want to sanitize as well. Gothic stories won't let you do that, though, because in the case of the fly, Ronnie, in that impossible sort of trolley problem situation, doesn't love Stathis, even though he's a normal, physically healthy man. She doesn't love him. She loves Seth Brundle, and that love and that attraction is very Gothic. That oscillation where she loves him, even though he's Seth Brundle telepod combination, and he's just this really unhappy mass of tissue and metal that's in front of her, and everything else around her is just mist and light and confusion, and she grabs the shotgun, right? And at first to defend herself, but then when she looks more closely at him, she realizes that Seth is still there. Then he asks her, wordlessly, again, the idea of the abject is mute, to kill him. So she blows his head off, essentially destroying the last of him that is even organic at that point. But notice how there is a failure for her to sanitize the situation without it being traumatic. She can't separate herself from Seth. No matter how monstrous he gets, she still loves him. Yes, it's a romantic treatment of love, and I don't think everyone would be along for the ride to that point. I think a lot of people would have moved away. But in Gothic stories, it forces the character in these conventional kind of ways, because what we have here is a fairly basic love triangle. Stathis, Ronnie, and Seth. But Ronnie's attraction to Seth is dangerous for her in a way that Stathis, his own attraction to Ronnie, also becomes dangerous because Seth is territorial to the point that he tries to kill Stathis at the end of the film, and Stathis has to suffer the embarrassment of trying to protect a woman who doesn't care about him and instead cares about this weird monster man at the end of the movie. And in the case of that film, it kind of works its way up to the more disgusting elements. But there are some pretty gross moments early in the film.
Oh yeah, well, like the vomiting on the food to dissolve it as a...
Even before that.
Oh, before that.
The baboon.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Baboon.
Yeah, the baboon is turned inside out.
Yeah.
And it's also suggested before that what's going to happen, where they're at the McDonald's, and Seth is trying to explain to Ronnie, I can only teleport inanimate objects. Something about the flesh doesn't work. It confuses the computer. And she's like, well, it can't be any worse than this, can it? And what is she doing? She's eating the cheeseburger. And notice there's a sense of displacement, where the cheeseburger is actually the byproduct of things that we would care not to think about while eating. Eating is something that is necessary for us to survive, that involves things that we would rather not think about relative to a cheeseburger. So that right there is just abject in and of itself, even though most of the things that we're thinking about, the butchery in an abject sense, were spared from that while they're in the McDonald's. The very next scene is the baboon teleportation sequence, where we're forced to watch an animal be turned inside out in a very Gothic kind of way, where again it involves mad science. There's a Promethean angle. They get really close to the telepod door, which is obscured by light and mist. What comes out of that after a birth, essentially? I mean, you look at the baboon, it's basically just a mess of organs and tissue. It's a very Gothic presentation of birth. And if you're wondering why mad science and birth are kind of connected, like from an experimental standpoint, because I'm pretty sure that most scientists don't see themselves as giving birth to truth and reason and things like that. This sort of Gothic output goes all the way back to Frankenstein. In that story, Victor was the mother and the father, where he created something new through this Promethean quest. And it's the same idea with Seth Brundle, where his quest is Promethean, but it has some very abject results.
And it segues somewhat with, in terms of this mad scientist, with also the Faustian bargain.
Yeah, there is a Faustian component because the Promethean investigator is often destroyed. And from an abject standpoint, they don't even have to be destroyed completely and utterly like Seth Brundle was. Just, if I could forget what I learned, I would be better off. In a Lovecraftian sense, sanity damage. But it doesn't have to be quite that literal. Lovecraft's characters just go insane. But they're also in this tiny little hermetically sealed bubble. Lovecraft was a very racist individual, and his characters were incredibly xenophobic, so the exposure to things outside of that bubble for them was more traumatic than it may have been for a less hyper-normal individual. The more normalized you are, and the more that you try and force that, the more fragile you are when being exposed to abject things. And that's definitely a takeaway from Lovecraft stories that he wrote himself.
Yeah.
This isn't something that we've really talked about yet, but also an exchange of power in ways where we tend to view ourselves as superior relative to something that is Promethean or is powerful in a way that we weren't expecting. There's a reversal. When we gaze upon the abject thing, the sense of the mother, right? The mother as having phallic properties, powerful or masculine properties from a traditional sort of standpoint. The xenomorph in Alien is a phallic woman. It's the penis-headed man, but it rapes you and impregnates you. Not literally, because in that film it kills its hosts and then turns them into eggs. It has maternalistic qualities. Because it kills you, it renders you into raw material that it can turn into a new egg. And it's this sort of perversion of the reproductive cycle. It's monstrous and it's abject. And again, that notion of that hybrid progeny. Anything that's being born in a Gothic story, you can bet your bottom dollar that it is going to be monstrous, but in a hybrid kind of way. But even if something is kind of hybrid, the sense of defeat on part of the Promethean quester is by being exposed to something that shows that the real power, true power, relative to you, the human character, according to things that are greater than you, like death, time, fate, destiny, the past, is going to have a maternalistic quality. But you're not necessarily talking about someone who's related to you directly, but is the symbol of a mother that you get to respond to according to your own fears and according to your own sense of return to a space. Metroid, for instance. Samus comes home to Zebeth. What's waiting for her? But isn't just there to greet her with open arms, but she has to investigate and find Mother Brain. Mother Brain is the archaic mother in this sense, where she is what's waiting for Samus in the womb state.
But she also spawns a legion.
It's tricky, because some of the animals in Metroid are seen as indigenous. They existed before Mother Brain got a hold and infected them in different ways. The infection of the archaic mother in different stories takes different forms. Mother Brain is more biomechanical, sort of that Geiger-esque fusion of tissue and machine, kind of like Brundlefly at the end of The Fly. Mother Brain, same idea. There's a biomechanical component. There are also the Metroids in that, which are sort of like the endemic monsters of the habitat, which Mother Brain was, as a machine, designed to regulate. And see how all of this kind of swims together? It can be literal. Mother Brain is literally a brain in a jar. Though in Super Metroid, she has a body and she can walk around, and you're forced to do battle with her. Relative to Samus's own fears of motherhood, which are represented by her own hideous offspring. She's a surrogate mother, right? And who's going to be afraid of childbirth? Someone who's actually been through it, or someone who has yet to give birth for the first time? Samus is, for all accounts, a virgin, and she's afraid of that. Maybe not at an active level, but her looking after the Metroid larva is traumatic any way you slice it. The character herself is actually pretty stoic. She doesn't say anything, but she's constantly, through her own quest to look after and protect this thing, we realize, what has she been protecting? The Metroid larva, which is a monster. So in that sense, her misguided motherhood isn't that different from Ronnie's relative to her loving Seth Brundle. Samus loves the Metroid larva. It's not just a job. She's not just a bounty hunter. She's looking after this thing, this dogged sense of, okay, just forget about it. Ripley and Aliens, same idea. Newt is being cocooned. In 15 minutes, this place is going to be a cloud of vapor the size of Nebraska. That's what Bishop says to Ripley. Like, the atmospheric processor, this castle, is going to explode. We don't really have enough time. This is a fool's errand. Samus's fool's errand culminates in this motherly quest where the surrogate mother is in love with this hideous monster. But here's the clever part. It's not just total monstrosity, because at the very end, when Samus is forced to confront Mother Brain and complete her quest, the Metroid saves her. And when it's killed, we actually feel sad. There's a human connection with something that is monstrous, and that's another function of the abject. That relationship between us and them is that often the monster is us. And the thing that we are projecting our monstrous qualities onto has human components, or human potential, if you will.
It at least mirrors us in some way.
It can. It's a repository for abject things, but also for human things. And you might say to yourself, it's a giant vampiric jellyfish, unusually large in the case of Samus's offspring, yet we are able to care for it at the end of the story. And that sense of power exchange, where it's not just the human character is made totally impotent by greater things, by the face of history, but that the face of history reflects things about ourselves that may give us a sense of power, but that power is monstrous. So Samus, when she's forced to confront Mother Brain, is forced to confront a reflection of herself through the space and the history of the space. Not in like a literal sense. Mother Brain is its own entity. But when you're confronting it, you're relating to it, and it reflects back upon you qualities of yourself that you might say are exclusive to Mother Brain aren't. Because what is Samus at that point? She's a one-woman army. She's armed with the space itself, its components, stolen through rapine, right? Just forceful violence. She takes pieces from the space, puts them on her own body, on a suit of armor that is designed to receive them, which she has also inherited. It's her birthright to become the ultimate destroyer. And her homecoming culminates in the death of Mother Brain, the harsh truth, the reality that I'm in love with a monster, the Metroid larva, and the destruction of her homeworld by her own hand, guided by some of these foolish, questful antics. The horror! that is the abject. So it's not just icky, gross, but just us relating to it in a very organic, slimy kind of way, in a figurative sense, too. Relations to the home, to power, autonomy, fate, death. All of that kind of exposes attractions to things. Ronnie, Seth, Samus, larva. Give me an example of something, an abject attraction.
I suppose vampires, they feed on blood, which is something that we put abject qualities on. Something that we generally don't want to see on the outside of ourselves. It's something that's hidden within our bodies.
It's also not a good idea to drink people's blood.
That too. that behavior in and of itself is rather abject. And they do that in a quest for immortality. The
Faustian bargain, which is, in that case, a sanguine quest for immortality. The Faustian bargain is either a promise of knowledge, power, everlasting life, something along those lines. If I can just find the right kind of knowledge, I'll live forever, right? And having, in some ways, achieved that, I guess the attraction there is to be in proximity of that power. Absolutely. Again, the attraction to the monstrous is to be in the presence of power. Yeah. Things that can conquer death or conquer fear of death and make it just seem like, or something that is attractive, but under the wrong conditions can result in self-destruction in different ways. women in courthouse scenes, Ted Bundy's court case, where you had women who were attracted to him. They can look at him through the glass, or even be in close enough to touch him, to be a member of the jury or a member of the audience, because that case was televised. And you had the bailiff, right? The armed guard, who if he tried anything funny, the bailiff would tackle him to the ground and have him in handcuffs before they could have a chance to even argue. Mm-hmm. That's another thing, is you're exploring things that if you were to actually come into contact with would be traumatic. Seeing an actual dead body, or the flesh flies that are crawling through the walls in the case of my brother and his wife. That was an unpleasant experience, but to see something like that through a buffer, media serves as a buffer to allow us to explore things relative to our own fears, where we can use the dark mirror to find a sense of control, right? It's traumatic for the characters in the story because they have no sense of control or ability to determine how close or how far away or how attracted they are to something abject, whereas we have the choice to pick up the story and read about it and experience these things in a way that is safe.
And indulge in morbid curiosity.
Yes.
To explore these taboo things, whether it's concepts or taboo in the sense of just unclean or
textually
yeah
speaking.
Textually it's a safe way of, you're not going to catch any bloodborne diseases from the movie screen, it's and likewise you're safe from the monsters on the other side as well.
There's a sense of totality or fulfillment, of completion, where when faced with these things we feel as though the presentation of a normal relationship is actually quite empty. And to get that feeling of fulfillment, we have to go to monstrous sources to feel sentiment. Complete sentiment is often a marriage of the monstrous and the normal to create something kind of hybrid. It's a tenuous proposition, it's transient, and it only occurs in specific situations. That would be the Gothicist argument to people who are attracted to stories that are monstrous. An onerous counter-argument is, I like this because it's romantic. It doesn't have anything to do with the icky stuff or the gross stuff, but you can't extricate one from the other. Your Seth Brundle is a package deal. The tragedy at the end of the film is that he is just this mess of tissue. The tragedy at the end of Metroid, for Samus, her predicament is not desirable at the end of the film. She's in love with a monster, which dies. Despite having fulfilled her quest, that sense of triumph is that rocky sense of triumph, where it only feels triumphant because the movie ends and it doesn't allow you to reflect on the reality of the situation. Samus has just been put through the ringer. Her child is dead. Her home is destroyed. She's conquered it, but she's going back to be a bounty hunter. Her homecoming, for all intents and purposes, was either a failure or transformative in such a way that she has become the ultimate destroyer.
Oh yeah, I mean the one thing she leaves with is all the weaponry.
Yes, yes, absolutely. So. And she's surrounded by the vacuum of space. Yeah. In her case, it's not quite like Alien, where she's not stranded. See you next mission, essentially. But then there's a sense of recruitment there, and I'm trying to remember if there are any other stories in Metroid that involve planetary destruction. I don't think so. There's the research station in Metroid Fusion, which is destroyed at the end of... Something is always blown to pieces, and Samus is always kind of preserved. But there is a sense of abjection, where latter-day Samus is very normalized in order to kind of deter from the troubling implications of what she actually is. A murderer for hire. She's a destroyer, an armor, who systematically goes to a new world, blows open its doors with missiles, blows open its walls and floors with bombs, steals everything, uses it herself to kill the indigenous population. She does this over and over, and then at the end of the film she's spotless. She's a bikini model. That notion of hiding all of that behind like a beautiful normalized image. It has a vampiric component. Lots of vampires, not all of them, but they are romanticized. They are beautiful. They're also recursive, reoccurring, and ancient. For all intents and purposes, Samus doesn't age. She's constantly beautiful, and she's very vampiric. I'm taking some liberties here because an actual vampire actually drinks blood. And a lot of people hermeneutically get hung up on that. Samus is a vampire metaphorically. Whereas a vampire is a vampire because that's how it actually behaves. It's still a metaphor, though, relative to things more generally, that the abject is kind of talking about. Because it is a metaphor more often than not, but...
But she's still a destroyer untouched by time.
Yes. Or just the consequences of her actions. There's no tribunal at the end. There's no persecution. She's not held accountable for any of her actions. And from a post-colonial standpoint, she could be recruited by an agency, which happens in later Metroid stories, where she serves like the United Federation League or something equivalent to that, a military organization. Ripley, same idea, doing the dirty work of the colonial marines. And that sense of power, which is told in an abject way in Gothic stories, is just another critical component. It's a bit far removed from the Gothic romance of The Fly, but often there is a romantic quality in the sense of being attracted to someone in an amorous way or a motherly way. And Samus isn't exempt from that. And vampires tend to have an amorous component as well, because what is love? It's an attraction to various things, and the abject plays off of that in ways that highlight either the disgusting or the profane, but an exchange or reflection of power that isn't favorable to the person experiencing the feelings. But the paradox is they want to feel that because without it, they don't feel whole. Why consume media like this? To achieve something that we can't experience otherwise because society sort of prohibits it. Abjection is real. It occurs in society. And I guess from a critical standpoint, so many of these monsters, Frankenstein's monster, the creature, is a scapegoat. He is someone who is persecuted. And it allows us to explore feelings of persecution without having to be persecuted. You want to be able to understand someone else's point of view without actually having to literally be in their shoes. So if I watched Schindler's List, I want to know what it feels like to be in that unspeakable situation. Except a Gothic story would focus on the monstrous aspects of that. It's not just the drama of someone being persecuted and killed for being subhuman. Subhuman as in being other, being abject, being monstrous, being full of like pustules and boils and afterbirth. I mean, there's so many different ways that someone can be abject just from a visual standpoint. Which, again, is something that is put there, but also something that we relate to back and forth.
So, way of exploring hypocrisies in a way that you can recognize your own potentially, but viewing them from an outsider's perspective. In that sense, an author could potentially get across a sort of moral without beating it over the head of the reader.
Yeah, from an exhibition standpoint, absolutely. It's just you're letting the material speak for itself.
Yeah.
There's no need to use exposition to spell things out because you just put it in front of someone and then they can become horrified and be forced to confront and process that information in a way that is transformative. Gothic stories present the horrifying and the disgusting, which we might respond to in one way going into the situation, escaping that situation or leaving it. We have a newfound empathy towards things that would normally be seen as completely other.
Exactly.
Yeah. And the hypocrisy that's being explored is characters in the story that we might side with initially, that later we feel actually kind of repulsed by. They're witch hunters. Witch hunters or Nazis. Nazis were very overt in terms of their persecution, but it's not always that obvious. Abjection can occur according to people who say that they are good, that they are Christian, that they are merciful, that they don't judge other people, but then in the presence of the abject, their true colors are exposed. Their lack of mercy, their inability to process things or empathize with, or just even respond in a way that is constructive. Because some people, when they're faced with these things, they realize how awful they are, and they just kind of fall apart.
Well, I mean, you could definitely extrapolate that to just authority figures in general. Given the task of policing, that they've been presented with power ostensibly for the good of the people, while they could probably still, in a way, justify it in that initial framework. We can watch that play out in a horrific way. Like a witch hunter.
A witch hunt or apartheid, which is a very real phenomenon. It occurs. But again, with District 9, you have an agent of the government who goes in, and we get to watch an abortion scene where he's destroying the eggs and he's making jokes about it. It's a bit like popcorn, is the way that he explains it in that movie, where they found the house full of eggs and they light it on fire. And it's actually a form of government-sponsored euthanasia against the natives. In the movie, they're presented as coming from outer space, but for all intents and purposes, they symbolize actual people who are being mistreated by the government. Apartheid.
Yeah.
And that type of thing can also be explored. And is there a redemptive element to hypocritical characters? Will they learn something that allows them, as privileged members of society, to change society for the better? In the case of that particular character, he effectively goes native in a way that is self-destructive, and it kind of guarantees that the message is not going to get across. It's all kind of lost in the hurly-burly, the gunfire. Whereas a character like Victor Frankenstein is unable, as a hypocrite, to process any of this. He is dead set on the creature being the demon, to the point that he tells the hero, look, when I'm gone, guide your sword towards his chest and my hand will be on the pommel to steer it true. So he's so convinced that he's right that his actions will guide the survivors from the afterlife. That's kind of a failure when presented with these things. He's unable to process it, and his hypocrisy makes him a very unattractive character to people who might otherwise side with him from a visual standpoint. They look at Victor and say, okay, you're an affluent, intelligent member of society, but put in this type of situation where you're forced to confront the other, you handle it in a way that is very selfish, very childish. He's unable to sort of process his own stupidity.
It's kind of also like Captain Ahab.
Yes.
Or, pursuing the whale. Ostensibly, the whale would be the monster, but his single-minded focus is what really makes...
It leads to his own destruction.
Yeah.
In that story, there are complexities, of course. There's the technological singularity, where if Victor Frankenstein, gives the creature a mate, he argues for the possibility of world domination at the hands of the monster. It's all framed from his point of view relative to the monster as self-destructive, and there's no way to really guarantee at that point because the monster has been abused and it doesn't really trust humanity. And they're kind of bargaining at gunpoint, and there's a sense of the creature needs Victor's knowledge. Victor needs the creature to go away. The creature won't. Victor won't give his knowledge, and there's a failure to meet any sort of compromise, which results in everyone dying. Though in the case of the creature, you can't really blame it because it's been traumatized by its maker. Whereas Victor had a perfectly happy life. But from an abject standpoint, he was set up to be traumatized later because he's been made to feel normal in an abject kind of way that doesn't prepare him to actually be a good parent. And when faced with that, he's the monster. He's the demon. He's the one who's doing the most fucked up things.
He's abjecting more violently than maybe you would otherwise, just because he's kept such a pristine, sanitized space around himself.
Exactly. And that never goes away.
Yeah.
And you can argue that it's a form of self-preservation, but it's the self-preservation at the expense of the self. The creature, all of Victor's friends are murdered and killed, and he's constantly passing the buck. This is a huge problem. Yeah. And then his legacy is his own stupidity. The science is pretty incredible. Just, wow, what an accomplishment. You made life out of nothing. You escaped your biological origins. You are the mother and the father. There's tremendous power in that. Yeah. He's God, basically. And yet, it's tainted by his legacy to self-preserve. And also, kind of his message at the end is, oh, well, I think that everyone should stay in caves and be stupid. Which led to the problem to begin with. The beginning of his life was happy and ignorant. And if you go back to that, eventually people are going to become curious and they're going to explore. But if the stability of society is set up through hyper-normalization, when faced with the abject, was to prevent this vicious cycle from repeating itself. And that's the tragedy of the story. And being able to confront these types of things allows us to open our minds and think critically. That's why they occur in Frankenstein, in The Fly, District 9, Metroid, any other story you can think of with abject components. There is a fulfilling quality, an educating quality relative to ourselves as hypocritical, as the actual destroyer of the situation. And you can't really do away with it. Someone like Samus is a destroyer at the end of the story, but she doesn't have to go around blowing up planets. You know, it's a way to teach us to become self-aware, as opposed to just being guided by instinct, being guided by desire to just sort of self-preserve, something that is inherently self-destructive. Terminator 2, it's in your nature to destroy yourselves. That kind of thing. And that's the folly of the situation, is being unaware of these tendencies. But you have to be comfortable in swimming in things that are disgusting. You have to be able to relate to monsters. And it's not always safe or pleasant. There is a horrifying component to that.
I think we've,
That's about it.
Yeah, I think that's been a pretty thorough exploration of the abject.
Yeah, absolutely. This podcast, for the time being, is available exclusively on YouTube. If you'd like to support our work and what we do, a link to my Patreon will be in the description below. Expect new content in the future. These tend to come out once per week. And in the meantime, thanks for watching and take care.
Bye.